Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. It is Sunday. It is Saturday at 11:40. Hope everyone's doing good. We had some pretty crazy weather yesterday. It snowed, actually snowed, and it was really cold and rainy. So I just kind of vegetated, slept a lot. It was nice. So watched some good movies. I did a show on it yesterday. It's probably, I don't know, it might be my favorite movie. Again, it's hard to say because there's so many, but it might be my favorite Mondo Macabro movie. Satanico Pandemonium, which is a Spanish nun exploitation movie that I fucking think it's just amazing. I did a show on that yesterday morning, and I watched it again last night. I've seen that movie so many times that it's insane. I just love that movie. So I watched that last night, and then I started to watch this movie that I found. Just came across it totally randomly, called The Swap, which is a really old Robert De Niro film. And I started watching it last night, but I started watching it a little bit too late. So I was like, wait, I'm gonna wait. I'm gonna wait till tonight to finish it and to watch it. I typically I'm a night person, obviously, but if I start a movie too late, like say 12:30, that's a little bit too late for me. Just because my concentration isn't there, and I can't really concentrate on the movie enough. I start getting really tired at that point, or just foggy, extra foggy. So I started watching it a little bit after I finished Pandemonium. I had never seen this movie, The Swap, and it's a really old film that I never heard about Robert De Niro. But I started watching it, and I got about maybe half hour or so into it, and I really liked it. It's kind of this low budget exploitation movie. It's super low budget, and I think he did it around the time that, I don't know. I think it might have been before Taxi Driver. I got to check more info about it, but I'm gonna finish that, and I might do a show on it depending on how good it is. But so far, I'm really digging it. So yeah, and then today's show is gonna be on my favorite band, Autechre, and a series of albums that they put out, which is crazy to me to think that these albums came out 5 years ago. And I tried doing this video a while ago, probably three, 3 weeks ago to a month ago, but I had some technical problems and I had to scrap the video, and it was a long video. I did I shot the video and thought it came out pretty decent, and the video was all kind of messed up, so I had to scrap it. So this is take two of that video, and I have a lot of experiences. I had a lot of experiences around these two albums when they came out, and a lot of thoughts that I wanted to share. Autechre is my favorite band of all time, and it's a band that I feel like you just can't talk enough about them. So today's show is going to be on a series of two albums that they actually put out, where the first one came out, which is called Sign. It came out initially on 2020, or I should say 2020. The first album came out 2020, Sign. And then I think it was about maybe 2 months after that initial release, they released a second album called Plus. And it basically, both both of these albums it's like a double album set. And I just had a lot to talk about with these albums, and they were their last the last studio albums that Autechre actually put out. They've been putting out a lot of releases since then, and again, it's so crazy that I think it was 5 years ago. They've put out a lot of releases since then, box sets, and they've been in this habit, which I did a big show a little while ago back of where they've been releasing all of these live recordings, these really high end quality recordings of all of these shows that they played. I think it was the summer before last, or maybe it was last summer. Autechre went on a really huge tour, and they recorded all of the shows, and they've been releasing them as like essentially albums. And I did a big show talking about all of those releases, and they're just amazing. And there's like about 9 hours in this set. I mean, and I've talked a lot about Autechre being, for me, well, just the most inspirational, the most inspiring. Especially when it comes to the music side of things, they are the most influential thing for me with my band Quantum. Along with many other kinds of music, but and electronic music, but they are definitely the guys for that. And I'm always captivated about just how prolific they are. They're the most prolific musical group that I know. The only thing I can compare it to is like, take Frank Zappa for instance, where there's just so much music that there's still new things being released, 30, 40, maybe even 50 years later. So, yeah, I want to talk about these two albums and all things kind of related to it, because it was a very strange time, a very particular snapshot in life and in kind of our world history. So 2020, of course, was the time of this little thing called COVID. And the actual year of 2020 was, the year when the global lockdown happened. A period of time in history that really was unlike anything else. When plagues and things of that nature are not, obviously they're not new to our world. When we think of the Spanish flu and things like that, and we're, in some ways things like that were deadlier, but as far as the sheer size of our population on this planet, how quickly it affected everything to where it went from an epidemic to a pandemic within a matter of like weeks, to where you had whole cities basically shutting down and closing down. Completely surreal. And so I'm going to just talk about the experiences leading up to this album, these albums being released by Autechre, and the time frame of it, which it was such a strange, incredibly strange time, but the timing of it in a lot of ways couldn't have been better. It was culturally it was such a significant thing, and this monumental situation that we've never known of experiencing ever before. So I remember, and this, starting out, it kind of ties in with movies. But I remember, I think it was in January or February, up until, the last few years, like during COVID and, 2021, 22, 23, there were, there was probably about, it probably had been about 2 years since I went to a movie theater, or until I went to a place where there were other people. So I remember in February of 2020, I went with a friend to go to the movies. And at that point, up until, the last couple of years, because I have been going back to the movies quite a bit, up until that point, that was in February. I went with a friend to go see Lee Winnell's The Invisible Man. That movie will always have. I'm a huge fan of that movie anyway, and I've talked about that movie. I've reviewed it, but that movie will have, will probably forever have this certain kind of significance for me of the COVID experience and what all of those things entailed. So I remember, yeah, I went with my friend Emmett to go to Flagship Cinema, which is close by. We went to go see The Invisible Man, and it was like late February or something like that. Still wintertime, and we went to the theater to see it. I went into that movie pretty cold, like I try to do with most movies, even now, and we both really loved it. It is an awesome movie. The Wolfman that he just put out this year is kind of a train wreck of a movie. That was a very disappointing movie. But anyway, I really love Lee Winnell's work for the most part, with the exception of The Wolfman. So we went saw this movie. It was really awesome. It was fantastic, and I loved that I went into it cold. Up until that point, for going to see the movie, and generally to go see movies, I would, you know, read some reviews. I would, check out things about it and what have you. But I found that if I went into a movie more just cold and not knowing that much, it was way more exciting. Especially if it was, a really great movie. I did that with X, a few years later. Ty West movie, and that, amazing movie. So I kind of stick to that time timeline as far as when I see a movie. I try to stay away from reviews and trailers. I'll get a little bit of a thing, I'll check out some things, but I try to do it at a real limited, um, you know, with a real limited amount of time. So we loved the movie, totally loved it, and then I remember it was probably a couple of weeks or so after we saw The Invisible Man. I was really curious to find out more about this movie, and I was looking it up. I was seeing interviews, and I was like, this is really great, and got really interested more so in Lee Winnell's career because he was the creator and starred in the first Saw film that kind of launched the franchise. And I discovered him more. I discovered this other movie that he did. I didn't see it till a few years later, Upgrade, which is a fantastic movie. And one day I was looking up online about, because I'm a nerd. Sometimes I look up, the weekend box office tally of like what movies are out and what movies are commercially doing well. And The Invisible Man did really well in the theater. It was a big success. I owned it on Blu-ray, and I really love that movie. But anyway, I was looking it up, and I saw like online somewhere that it had done really well in the box office, and there was a little bit, there was an interview with one of the executives for the studio that put out the film, Bloomhouse, and I don't know if it was Jason Blum, the owner, or not, but it was somebody really involved with the company in the film, and he was talking about how initially they were really kind of nervous about putting out the film at the time, and because of what they were reading about this really highly infectious disease called COVID-19, and I was like, what is that? That was literally the first time I heard about COVID, and that was how I yeah, that was my introduction to what, like, where I was like, what is this? That's really strange. Didn't know anything about it, hadn't heard anything about this disease or what it kind of entailed at that time. And I remember it really kind of struck me like, huh, what is that about? That's really weird. And so I kind of, I don't know, sort of forgot about it, I guess. But it stuck in my memory. Like what was that about? What did I just read? That's really unusual. And then I remember going, you know, over to my folks for dinner about, a month or 2 months after that. And we had like Chinese food or takeout, and they had the news on, and suddenly this big story came on about COVID, and that these cruise ships that these cruise ships, these big giant cruise ships that hold 1,000 people, whatever, that travel all around the world. Suddenly, a lot of these cruise ships were having these massive cases of COVID, and that all of these people were getting infected and really, really sick, and that a lot of these ships, because they go everywhere in the world, people were saying that this was attributing to the spread. And I remember eating dinner over there, and this was on during the news, on the news, and I'm just like, what the fuck is this? Like, it was something out of a fucking zombie apocalypse, and I was just like, what? And and it was like coming so fast, and it was so fast and furious, and I was like, I don't know. At that time, when it was coming in, this information, when I was getting this information, I was kind of like, I was kind of pretending I wasn't really hearing what I was, I was pretending I wasn't seeing this news. It was like I was kind of in this like automatic thing of like denial and just being like, okay, well, how turning, watching the news would be in the background, and I remember like turning to my parents and be like, hey, so what are you doing? What are you guys doing this weekend? Changing the subject, and in the back of my head, I'm like, what the fuck is this? Like, I couldn't comprehend it. But I was kind of like pushing it away and just kind of in this denial state. And then, like, at that time, I was rehearsing with this band that we've been on this big hiatus for a very long time. We haven't played in a very long time, but at that time, I was a band that I play with, and we're still probably gonna get back together at some point. But I play in this band called Electric Bonfire, and we rehearse. At that time, we used to rehearse every Wednesday night in Lincolnville, which is 15 minutes away from here, and we would rehearse every Wednesday. And that week, went over to rehearsal like we would do every week, and we were talking a little bit before we were going to start our practice, setting up some stuff. And one of the guys in the band, Mitch, his kids are both in college, or they still are now, but they were just starting college at that time. And he told me that the school, the college or colleges, they went to two different colleges. I think one in New York and one somewhere else, maybe one in Boston. I can't remember. That the colleges basically shut down, and because of COVID, and they shut down early, or they announced that they were shutting down, and they were sending all the students home, and I was just like, what? That's crazy. And suddenly it was this thing of like, wow, like this thing is just getting more and more out of control. And it just kind of blew my mind. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And he said, yeah, all the kids, like my both my sons will be back home in a day or two, because the schools are closing down because of COVID-19, this highly infectious disease. And I was like, what the fuck? Like, that was my reaction. But again, I was still in this like weird denial state. Like, oh, okay, it's just, it's really temporary. It's not that big of a deal. Because it was so, I don't know. I think it was because it was so unusual and just such a seismic thing that I just was like, this isn't this isn't really happening, kind of a thing, which is, I think, a normal thing for what people would be doing. And so then during that time also, I I've worked with kids, and I've worked with mostly high school kids, and worked with preschool kids and all young kids, all different age groups. I've worked with kids now and children for about 10 to 12 years, and I really love working with kids. I it's such a cool job. I just love the energy of being around kids, and I don't have any kids of my own, but it's really I don't know, the being a child and having that perspective. It's something, that magical perspective. You kind of lose it as you get to be an adult, and you try to hold on to it. You know, and the other side, kids are, obviously it's a lot of work, and it's kids are crazy. They're little psychopaths running around and all those things, but overall it's amazing. But at that time, I used to, for about 10 years, I worked in Camden, which is about 15 minutes away from here, and I worked there for about 10 years. And so that Friday, I was went to work like a normal day, still thinking about this shit that I'm hearing about this COVID thing, and I was just like, what the fuck? And it just seemed like obviously things were moving so fast and rapid, at this rapid pace, that it was like this. It felt like there was this sense of impending doom, or this like giant wave that is way off in the distance, and it's just a matter of time till it's going to land on shore and just wipe everything the fuck out. It was like that. That was the feeling of it. And I went to work that Friday. And again, I had practiced that Wednesday. It came up again, and it was like hitting home much more at that point because of colleges being closed across the United States. And there were also reports of, in almost virtually every state at that point, that there were all of these infections going on. And it was spreading so rapidly. In Maine, where I live here in Maine, there weren't any cases yet. So there it wasn't really a thing happening yet. But it was going to be, it was inevitable when we were going to start hearing about that here. So I went to work that next day, or Friday, and I've worked at the teen. I had worked at the teen center for about 10 years at that point, for a long time, and so I went to work, and then midday, um, my boss. I looked over at my boss, in his office, and he had the news on, and there was a big presidential press conference, and Trump was our president back then, unfortunately. And he gave this big State of the Union, or basically this emergency speech about COVID, and it was on every network, and he had it on, and it was a regular busy day. Um, we were it was I remember that day like it was yesterday, but it was a real busy day, and kids were running around, and we had a lot of things going on, a lot of hustle and bustle and things, parents coming and picking up the kids, and just a normal day. And I remember this press conference came on with this with Trump, and it was about this big announcement about COVID. And I remember everyone, suddenly the room went silent. Everything, all the noise and bells and whistles went away, and everybody suddenly, especially the staff at the teen center, we all stopped doing what we were doing. We went over to the TV, and we watched this whole speech, and it was like, I don't know, like a 35-minute speech, and this was like at noon, something like that. And it was announced that basically how serious this whole COVID thing was, and he was at that point announcing the lockdown, where basically every city, every business, every store, basically everything that we have access to, with the exception of hospitals, everything was shutting down, and with the exception of gas stations. Supermarkets were still going to be open, but there was all these new things that were going to be implemented. That's where the whole curbside thing started to happen, of where you could only, order food and order things, and then it would be kind of delivered to you on the curb, or you had to wear a mask to go in. And but initially everything was shut down, and including work, all like job place, any place where people were you would have to gather with people, which was everything. So everything just shut down. And by 12:30, it was announced that, well, the teen center's closed. And so it was this frantic thing of calling all the parents, and all the parents came. And I remember that day there was a kid at the teen center who had it on his phone, on his iPhone. He said, "Yeah, they just found the first few cases of COVID in Maine." And that happened shortly before the this press conference. And so we were closed, and that was it. And I was just like, whoa. And suddenly all the parents came, all the kids were gone, and we left early. We left at like 1 o'clock. And we left under this feeling of like, okay, we have no idea what's going on. But we had this feeling that, I remember I had this feeling like, oh, okay, this will be just, a couple of days, or something like that. And it won't be that big of a deal. So I was, again, it was that state of denial, like thinking, oh, it's not that bad. It's going to be a few days, you know. And so we closed, we went home. And I remember going home, and a friend of mine had invited me to kind of sit in or play a gig that night. And I remember being on the fence about, I don't know if I want to go to this. I think I'm going to stay home. And I remember calling him and saying, hey, I think I'm going to pass. I'm going to probably just stay home. And they were like, yep, I understand. This is crazy. We're not sure really what's happening, but we're going to probably still do this gig or whatever. So I ended up not going to the gig, and I stayed home. And I remember the first thing I did when I was driving home, I stopped at the local supermarket and I bought like a 12 pack of beer. Came home and didn't know what to think. Obviously, nothing had really settled in. And I know this is kind of a very long video and a long kind of winded story, it's totally completely tied to Autechre, and these albums, but this is all, like, for me, so greatly connected. So bear with me for anybody who's interested in listening to this. But so I remember stopping at the store, getting this 12 pack of beer, and came home. And the next day I woke up, and I felt like it was kind of a normal day. And it was like, I just spent the time, like, I have a couple of beers and I'd go in my practice space and work on music stuff. And I did that for like 4 or 5 days. And it was odd because I was starting to I actually found myself really enjoying having this time free. And it felt like this weird snow day. And when we left work, we left with this feeling of, oh, we'll probably be back next week, but we didn't know when we were going to be going back, kind of a thing. But we had this feeling like, well, this will just blow over in a couple of days, or this is serious and we're going to take these precautions, but we'll be back to normal in a couple of days, kind of a thing. And so I remember 5 days into it, I was like, yeah, I was kind of digging it. It felt like a weird snow day or a series of snow days. And I was, staying kind of busy, and I'd go in my practice space, and I was working on a lot of music stuff. I was getting practicing in, and just kind of hanging out and having a couple of beers, and then at the end of the day, I'd watch movies like I normally do now, and it was great, and I started to see online that more and more places that were having music were starting to close. Bars and restaurants, clubs, different venues. They were trying to stay open, you know, they were like kind of the last ones to kind of be shut down. And I saw it like, watching stuff happen online on Facebook or whatever. I'd see, oh, this place closed in Bangor, this place closed in Portland. And then there was like a day or two and nothing, you wouldn't hear anything else. And then another place would close. And then within a week or two of that, every every fucking place was closed. And after about 5 days or 6 days of it, I was like, wow, like this is serious. And again, like initially I was feeling like this was kind of a weird vacation, a weird, bastardized snow day, if you will, if you want to call it that. And I was kind of oddly enjoying the time. And I remember, and I had a routine of doing whatever I would do and get up in the morning, have coffee, go, and relax, and then work on some music stuff for a while, and just have dinner, watch a movie or movies, and then all those kinds of things. And after a week or so of this, I remember I got up in the morning and I I started getting these super intense panic attacks. And I found that I couldn't get out of the chair anymore. And it was such an odd thing. It felt like my body weighed like 2 million pounds and I couldn't move myself physically. And suddenly I couldn't do anything. And it was the weirdest thing because it suddenly, it felt like I was weighted to my chair. And and this went on for like 2 or 3 days. Like I had barely enough energy to eat, and I would only eat once a day, and I would only eat when I was like absolutely starving, and I would eat late, like at night, and I couldn't sleep. I would be staying up till like 4 in the morning, and it happened like super fast. It all happened so quick, like this change. And this went on for about 4 or 5 days, and it just got worse and worse and worse. And I didn't know what to do, and mentally, physically, I just couldn't function. And I remember calling my parents and being like, I don't know what's going on here, but I can't really do anything. It's like physically, I can't really even get into the shower, or everything was shutting down. And I couldn't even go to the store to shop. It just got worse and worse. And this went on for probably 7 or 8 months. And it just got worse and worse. To where I, my mom would have to buy me my groceries and drop them off. And this was during the time of where CDC was recommending you washing off, basically bleaching and cleaning all of your groceries. And it just spiraled further and further out of control. And I experienced things that I never thought I had ever experienced before. I got to the point where I would make myself go for like to try to get out of the house or to drive around. I would, drive in my car aimlessly for hours at a time. I couldn't practice. I couldn't do anything, and I would make myself go for walks. And I was totally isolated from people and everything, even including my parents. And I started hallucinating. I started hearing voices. I'd get these weird flashes of where I'd start seeing all of these colors, like really bright fluorescent colors, Um, and I eventually had to get some help, and I did. But it was it was the most terrifying experience. I would get these like really terrifying dreams. Um, yeah, it was unbelievable. And I remember after about 7 or 8 months of this, I remember my parents, and things started to change a little bit here in Maine as far as COVID. Like the cases were started to somewhat recede. They were still really high, but a lot of the businesses and venues were starting to do outside gatherings and with music and all these kinds of things. Things were starting to get a little bit better, I guess. And I remember my parents had asked me about taking me to Bull Moose Music at the time, which is, my favorite place on earth. And shortly before that, I had heard that Autechre, my favorite band, was putting out a brand new album, Sign. And I was so excited, so incredibly excited. And I remember initially I was terrified of going to the store, of going to Bull Moose. And they had to kind of really convince me to do it. And I eventually said, okay, I'll do it. And leading right up to that, it was announced that Autechre was putting out this new album. And I was super fucking pumped, super excited. And, I've been a fan of their music for, over 20 years, maybe more. I got into them um, in the 90s, late 90s, when I was in college. So I was a huge, at that point, a massive fan. And I was really excited about the prospect of going to Bull Moose to buy some movies, which I hadn't done for a few years, and to buy some music, new music, which I hadn't, and especially pumped to go and buy the new Autechre album. So I remember that day like it was yesterday. My parents came to my house and picked me up, and they drove, and we drove to Waterville. We drove to the Waterville Bull Moose, which is one of my favorite locations for movies and things because, oddly enough, I mean each store for Bull Moose is a little bit different from each other. They all have a certain kind of characteristic or something that they do a little bit different. And some places, some Bull Moose stores have a better book selection. Some places have, some of them are very small. There's many locations. There's one in Bangor. There's one in Waterville. There's one in Lewiston, which I discovered last year. There's one in Saco, Maine. There's one in Portsmouth, which I think moved. There's one in Brunswick. So there's quite a few. I go mostly now to the one in Bangor because that one is really great. And Waterville is still really great. So we drove. Parents picked me up. We drove there. I was terrified as shit, but I made myself do it. Um, the feeling of just being terrified of just leaving your house um, is just it's the worst feeling that I've ever could imagine. And so I remember too during that time I you know in this total state of desperation. I remember looking it up online to try to like find some kind of answers because this was even before I I eventually talked to a friend who was a therapist, which was incredibly helpful for me, which I needed to do, but I didn't do it for a very very long time until I was so completely fucked up beyond comprehension that I had feelings of that I'm going to be, you know, I'm going to it's gonna get. I was so worried at one point that I was gonna eventually blow my brains out, or either ending up in a mental hospital because I couldn't function. I felt like those things were either was going to get that bad eventually if this didn't change, which was utterly terrifying, or my other alternative was either that's going to happen down the road if something doesn't change, or the only other way I'll function is in a mental hospital. So that's what I was like. That was my reality for a long time. And so you know, and it was a really long time till I eventually talked to somebody, and I did, and that really was a saving grace for me. Like that, things were still brutally hard, but it was it gave me a pathway to some light, you know. And I remember we drove to Bull Moose, and the first thing I did is I walked to the music section, and I saw right away they had both of the Autechre albums right there, and I was just like, "Fuck me!" I was so excited. I had never been more excited about buying something as that day was. Like, yeah, it was like the best experience I ever had, the best feeling I ever had of going and buying something that you want so badly. It was like pure elation, and I was super excited. They had both of the albums, both of these Autechre releases, and like I did say, both albums were released a little bit separately, but I bought them a little bit after the fact, so both albums were available. So bought some movies. I At that time I got really into. I had maybe a year or so before COVID had come. I got really into. I discovered Herschel Gordon Lewis, who is one of my favorite exploitation directors, one of my favorite directors of all time. I had discovered him through Opera House Video. I rented a compilation of all of these like sleazy, low budget exploitation movies, which they actually have a pretty decent selection of. And they had 2000 Maniacs on there, and I just was like, this movie is the fucking bomb. So I really got into Herschel Gordon Lewis, and I bought a few of his movies, which I was super excited on Blu-ray, and I bought these two Autechre albums. And I remember that day; it was a really nice day. It was like a spring day. The sun was out, and it was still chilly in the air, but it was warm. And I remember I that night I was going to go over to my folks for dinner. Like later on that night, that was the plan. And I remember, again, like I said, they drove, and I was so fucking excited to listen to these albums. I was so excited because again, even at that time, they were my favorite band, and just the significance of like going out in public and buying stuff that I love, and kind of socializing with people, like where it's like, I don't know, kind of normal, was like the most amazing experience. Seeing people. And so my parents dropped me off, and right away I grabbed my keys and I got in my car and I drove down to Bayside. And Bayside is a beautiful area right behind where I live, and it's all I live along the coast. I love living where I live, here in Mid Coast Maine, because I love being close to the ocean, and we have we're I'm like 2 to 5 minutes from the ocean. I love that we have that, but then there's tons of beautiful forests and woods all around. And I remember, and Bayside is this really beautiful area that becomes a very populated place during the summer. There's a lot of houses that get rented and cottages. There's a lot of wealthy people that live there that have these beach houses and things. But it's a beautiful, beautiful spot, and you can drive down, and there's all these, there's like four or five just amazing spots to go swimming, to just park your car and have a picnic or whatever. But there's all these beautiful beach area fronts, and I got in my car, grabbed the two Autechre albums that I just bought, and my plan was to go down to my favorite spot by the water and crank these albums and listen to them. And again, it was a really nice day, and I drove down to my favorite spot down in Bayside and rolled the windows down, had the car running, and at that time my car had a really nice sound system. It was at that car is long gone and long dead now, unfortunately, but that car had the best stereo system in it that I've ever had. And I cranked it. I put in signs and I cranked it. And it was one of the greatest well, not one of. It was the greatest experience that I've ever had listening to new music. It really was. And obviously because of the dire situation, the desperation of living that way, and how the world was at that point. This was also the time of the riots. George Floyd, who was, executed and killed by the police, a black man. So the riots were happening, and it literally felt at that time the world was ending. And I'm a huge fan of post-apocalyptic stories and dystopian stories. The Road Warrior franchise is one of my favorites. I'm a huge Philip K. Dick fan. And there were things that I was seeing that I never thought I would see. And I literally felt, during that time, I literally felt the world was ending. I literally felt this whole, like, experiment of a democracy or like a civilized world, it was burning down, literally, and was going to collapse. And I literally felt that way. So I had the most profound experience listening to this music. And it remains, 5 years later, which is fucking insane. It remains for me, these two albums, these two Autechre albums, for me, for the obvious reasons, massive Sign and Plus, both of these it's a double album set initially. For me, it has more significance to me or for me than any other album in my life. But I also think I also think it's some of the best music that they ever put out. The music is really atmospheric. They kind of return to a little bit more of a period of the earlier part of their career, where the music is much more. I feel like the music has a more ambient quality. It's more stripped down. It's not quite as frantic or choppy in a lot of ways like rhythmically. A lot of their albums are very abstract that way. But I felt with Sign and Plus, it was kind of a return to form of their more ambient quality. They still have that very intense dark sound, but there's a certain kind of ambience or ambient quality or atmospheric quality to these albums that I think is just gorgeous. And to me, I've always felt Autechre as a futurist band, And for me, it totally listening to these two albums, and I spent many, many times and hours listening to these albums back to back. To me, it is the epitome of the experience of what I was going through, and like every it's the soundtrack for that in every conceivable way that there is. So much so that I can't really even put it into words, you know. And again, there's so much music out there that always resonates with people and resonates with you, and movies that bring you back to your certain time of your life, good or bad, and that's the beauty of art. But this was so much more significant, and even to this day, like these albums remain some of my favorite records that they ever put out, and they're some of my favorite music that they ever did. I just think it's just absolutely the albums are just incredible. And I've probably listened to these albums more than anything else they have put out. And that's saying a lot because I listen to their music virtually every day. So, yeah, just absolutely incredible stuff. So I know I talked a lot about a lot of discussed a lot of things here. It's about 51 minutes here, and I never really talked about these kinds of things before, and how I've always talked about my enthusiasm and my deep love of Autechre, but I wanted to really kind of give a real view of why that is a thing and why it has so much significance for me. So, if you haven't checked them out as a band, um, I can't recommend them enough. So, thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.